Physicalism, or the idea of this freestanding objective physical world, was completely blown away when I had a UAP experience that responded to my intentions. We're saying something that sounds crazy. We're saying that everything is consciousness and that things don't exist.
I had an experience, and then the intellectual investigation into the philosophy later served for me to get my thinking intellectual side to accept my experience.
It left me open to the idea that everything is not what it appears to be necessarily, just because people are saying that.
I was a physicalist my whole life, and I was very anti-religion, right? And I would make one note here that, like, it's very understandable that as a reaction to sort of all of the history of religious ideas and those being taken to be axiomatically true, and all of the horrors that are meted out in those beliefs when they have political power, it makes sense that there'd be an aversion to questioning, the sort of new paradigm, which is a reaction to that. And so it's totally understandable that when people hear us, they're like, okay, these guys sound like they're about to sell me some kind of religion. We're not doing that.
But what that led me to was needing to get a comprehensive understanding of like every quantum experiment that has ever been done. And so what this was pointing to was that my classical intuitions about the physical world were wrong. Totally wrong.
What the physicalism does is it says there's this stuff called matter that exists outside of experience that is purely quantitative in nature, right? And that stuff just exists objectively outside experience and didn't require experience to come into being. And then it's from that we can actually get experience back out of it. And this is the circularity you're talking about.
Matter or physical stuff is defined as what can be wholly described by quantities, and it is that which has no qualities. But then we use that physical stuff to give an account for mind, which is that which has qualities, without any satisfactory explanation or theoretical mechanism, even in principle, of how that's possible. This sort of categorical, incommensurable shift from non-qualitative to qualitative occurs. So essentially what they're saying is that matter is both not qualities and also qualities. This is a P and not P logical contradiction. So we're saying something that sounds crazy. We're saying that everything is consciousness and that things don't exist. This obviously goes far and above away from what people would most intuitively understand about the world or think about the world, right? So I think it would be good to start this episode out by saying how we got here. What led us to the place that we are today as students of Bernardo Kastrup, you could say, and analytic idealism. So what brought you here?
Yeah, so that's a long story, but I can kind of condense it down. One thing I was thinking about before when we were talking about this episode and like what we might want to do with it is I was thinking about the fact that there's all kinds of different paths. And when it comes specifically to, we're talking about like a philosophy here. Like, is this something for me, at least, that was like, I just like started like digging in conceptually into what I thought about the world and just came to, studied all the philosophies, looked at science, had a bunch of conceptual reasoning, and then went, you know what? I think all things considered, reality is actually mental, not physical. And the answer to that question is definitely not for me. So, and I think like maybe, and we'll see when it gets to you, like if there's a contrast here, that's important to point out. But for me, my path was much more just kind of having a feeling from a very young age that like really nobody knew exactly what they were talking about. I mean, I was exposed to religion very young, but I was never religious. My family wasn't particularly religious, but they were sort of like just trying to, do the right thing and like take their kids to Sunday school or whatever. And I thought at that time as a very young person, like these adults here that like are proclaiming to know all of these things about the world, they don't know that. And like, they're full of shit. And so I was of the I never want to like really believe things on authority. I never thought that was a good reason to believe something. And so I was always really inquisitive about that. But really my story is one of like, one thing I did know is that I suffered. I had a lot of psychological suffering, and I was a atheist though and a physicalist. I was just as much of a sort of fully believing physicalist as my, all of our atheist physicalist friends would want. But I suffered, and I was always looking for some solution to that. And it was actually through somebody like Sam Harris, or somebody that I could actually trust as a physicalist, as someone who was thought of themselves as, I'm rational. I don't believe in anything on faith. He wrote a book called The End of Faith, which is one of my favorite books, because it was just like, yeah, this is what's wrong with the world. Everyone just has faith in stuff and they believe in things for no reason. And I, of course, don't do that at all. And and Sam Harris was like, yeah, like all this religion, it's all bullshit, and all this faith-based beliefs are silly. But there is this thing about meditative practice that can that is worthwhile and has something to do, like understanding the nature of mind has something to do with suffering. And so it was through that path that I actually could listen to somebody like that and say, okay, I'll try this meditation business, even though, if a guy came up to me in saffron robes and said, meditate, I'd have been like, yeah, go sell crazy somewhere else, dude. But I could listen to this rationalist physicalist. And it was through that practice that I became acquainted with the nature of mind, and I had an experience, right, that was a seeing through. It wasn't an experience where I gained a bunch of new beliefs, but it was an experience of seeing through beliefs that I had, and noticing that, in particular, it was the belief in the separate self at first. That is such a foundational thing that everyone sort of just takes to be axiomatically there. Like, oh, of course, I have this self, I'm separate from the world. And it was just seeing through of that belief, and becoming then very skeptical about that belief, that really experientially changed things for me. Yeah, and so it was the experience first that was like, oh, I was wrong about something. Like, I was wrong about something that I definitely thought I was completely right about, and it was totally unquestionable. That made me then open up to say, what else do I believe? Do I believe anything else that I don't know to be true? And that's kind of where it started for me.
So this realization for you was essentially that the separate self is not actually real.
Yeah, I mean, just to put a little more color to that, when you look at your mind, everyone just kind of has this feeling that they're writing their thoughts, that like you're an author that is composing all of your thoughts, and really you feel like you are your thoughts. And what can be seen through meditative practice is that those things are just happening on their own. I tell this story a lot, I know, in our lives that we do, but like I love the Sam Harris actually does this exercise where in front of like 2,000 people, he was like, I just want to invite everyone to close your eyes for 1 minute and try to stop thinking. For 1 minute, just don't think of anything. And then they do. He's like, all right, we're going to start now. And he goes ahead and just stops, says, close your eyes, stop thinking. And then a minute later goes, okay, the first thing he says is, some of you will be so deluded as to think you actually succeeded. And
Yeah.
I really like that because it gets at something that's true that you can notice, and that you don't have any control over these thoughts that are going through your head. And I won't say too much more other than to say, through practicing this meditative practice, which allows you to have some clarity on the nature of your mind, you can see other things about the nature of your mind that you thought were true that aren't. And the main thrust of that is a experiential seeing through, like ripping out the curtain on the Wizard of Oz, that this central self, this locus of attention that you think is you, doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, so it seems like once you saw through the nature of the self, the illusory self, it allowed you to ask deeper questions about the nature of reality. It sort of
Right.
gave you the permission because you're like, well, if I deluded myself in this way, how else am I deluded? Right?
Exactly. So that's when I said, okay, well, like something so foundational to my beliefs, like the self can dissipate. What else do I believe in? And of course, one of those things that eventually comes up when you start listening to other people who are talking about this is, do I know that reality is physical? Because I was so wrong about things before, and then when you start looking into that, you like to say, I know, yeah, it seems that way unless you think about it for like at least 20 minutes or so, and then you can see how that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think that's what. So, like, it seems like the thesis of your kind of journey, if you want to call it that, is when you're willing to question everything, you realize everything is questionable, and I
Yeah.
think that's what we have in common, even though it's a little bit of different paths to get here. Um,
Yeah, so
so
let's
to
hear, like, as I want to contrast those, because, like, again, I'd say mine was I had an experience, and then the intellectual investigation into the philosophy later served for me to get my thinking intellectual side to accept my experience. But maybe you can talk a little bit about how you came to this.
Yeah, so the way I've kind of organized it in my mind of how I got here to this crazy position is kind of in like three tiers, right? So at a very young age, like you, I realized that I could not trust authority. And this was like through sort of traumatic experiences, you could say. Um, but it's important to note that this mistrust, well, first of all, it's kind of a blessing and a curse throughout my life, right? This constant questioning of authority. But through this mistrust, it left me open to alternative explanations. It left me open to the idea that everything is not what it appears to be necessarily just because people are saying that. But yeah, and so like through that lens in this kind of like first tier, I also had several mystical experiences with certain substances that clued me in or gave me hints that everything is not as fundamentally disconnected as something like physicalism would have you believe. It really just gave me the experience of oneness that they speak of. I mean, I've had this experience, ego death, several times. But then the second kind of pillar or tier, if you want to call it that, I had a tragedy in the family that sent me down a scientific rabbit hole to try to gain a scientific understanding of reality. What is the nature of reality? What is the nature of consciousness? And this sent me into the quantum world. I first discovered like the double slit experiment, which completely blew me away. How particles can be in multiple places at once and their behavior changes based on observation or measurement and all this kind of stuff. But what that led me to was needing to get a comprehensive understanding of like every quantum experiment that has ever been done, delayed choice stuff, interaction free measurements, all this stuff. And so what this was pointing to was that my classical intuitions about the physical world were wrong, totally wrong. The world was much stranger than I had once believed. And so, eh, and what I also discovered on the scientific journey was that there is no neuroscientific explanation of consciousness. There's no explanation at all. There's no
Yeah.
science that tells us what consciousness is.
Yeah, and that's a big one. That's a big one that people will claim, that will come up and say, even some neuroscientists, which is just beyond the pale, but like that, oh no, this is science. We already know. What you guys are saying is bullshit because science says so. And that's not true.
Mhm. It's not true. And when I discovered that, it completely blew me away because I
Mm,
just naively accepted. It's why the mystical experiences that I had, I mean, they meant something for my psychology, but only insofar as they were kind of hallucinations that maybe cleared away some of the delusions, but it didn't really mean anything about the nature of reality.
mm,
It just meant something about like it just kind of showed me things where I could operate within my life a little bit better in a psychological way.
mm,
But when you start to understand that there is no scientific explanation of consciousness, your mind becomes open to other things. And then tier three, as I call it, physicalism or the idea of this freestanding objective physical world was completely blown away when I had a UAP experience
mm.
that responded to my intentions. Simply, the option of physicalism was no longer viable. It was completely clear to me at that moment. So after that is when I was like, well, what is going on here? Because I've had all these experiences, none of it matches up with the mainstream interpretation of stuff. And that's when I found Bernardo and analytic idealism.
Yeah, which gives a rigorous philosophical underpinning to what usually is sort of described by people, much to our chagrin, right? As like, oh, well, that's mystical. That's all just woo like stuff. And people sort of go into that camp, be like, I'm a spiritual person. So, and, you know, what we are talking about, yes, you can use the word spiritual, but what we're talking about is just this here, reality, not
Mhm.
something mystical or spiritual or any of that stuff.
Not
Just
something off
what,
far away. It's what we have in front of us right here, your
right.
normal everyday experience.
And what you come to realize is the beliefs that people have around what this is are not it's not like science says this is what you have to believe. This is literally ideology. And yeah, so that realization that like, oh, I've just sort of been told on authority, and many scientists will do this, right? Be like,
Yeah,
oh,
the
well, I'm
belie
a scientist and I'm here to tell you these metaphysics are true. And this is just a it's bad for science, it's bad for philosophy, it's just bad philosophy. It's scientists that basically don't, most of them don't think philosophy is worth a damn, and but they're happy to practice in it
yeah,
as much as they
naively, they
desire.
practice in it. Yeah, the beliefs that we hold about what this is, what this reality is, are cultural, not
Yeah,
factual.
yeah.
I think it's, like, really important to understand that.
So to bring it back, so that's interesting. Like both of us would say that part of our path was experiential. For me, the experience was primary, and actually, I knew after that, having that experience, that science was limited. There was a limited value in science in the sense that what there is to notice about mind, the scientific method is not accessible. It doesn't have access to that data because the scientific method relies on sense perception. And so I sort of blew off the like I did think that, oh, okay, I can see from science, we can actually see, and we'll talk about this a little later in this podcast, the empirical data from science can falsify an ontology. But I knew right away, I'm not gonna I'm you know, there's nothing, the people that take quantum physics and say, well, this proves my spiritual experience or has
Mhm.
something to do with that, are extending science beyond what it's
Yeah,
capable
it's
of.
important to know just really quickly that when I brought up the quantum topics, it doesn't prove analytic idealism. I want to be very clear about that. But
Mm,
what it did do is shatter my entire classical view of what is this freestanding, objective physical world. It just
right.
completely threw it out the window.
So I guess like the point though I wanted to get to was that the actual way to know anything about this is experiential, because as we're saying here, reality is experiential, right? It's not conceptual. And the conceptual philosophy, right, is a sort of helping game. It's not the game of all games. We're not here to convince you that reality is mental necessarily. We're not trying to say you should believe because we're saying these reasons, right? But there are beliefs that most people do hold, and particularly in modern Western culture and physicalism, that they don't think are just beliefs that are standing in the way, like he just said, of the idea, the sort of conceptual idea being the bouncer of the heart. They're just in the way of actually learning about the nature of mind because we think we already know the answer. And we're here to point out that we don't know that physicalism is true. It's not science that physicalism is true. And in fact, there are a host of reasons to that we're going to go through here to think that it's absolutely not true.
Yeah, so I mean, it was certainly true for me that I didn't even know that anything like this was possible. It just seems self-evidently true to me at some point in my journey that there was like this physical world, and then maybe there's some kind of God, but probably not, or whatever. But again, the thesis, it seems, of my story, your story, and even what Bernardo was just talking about is that when you're willing to question everything, you realize that everything is questionable, and there are good reasons to question those things. So yeah, you want to get into the sort of five critiques
Yeah, but
Castro has.
let me say also one note that because I was a physicalist my whole life and I was very anti-religion, right? And I would make one note here that like it's very understandable that as a reaction to sort of all of the history of religious ideas and those being taken to be axiomatically true and all of the horrors that you know are meted out in those beliefs when they have political power, it makes sense that there'd be an aversion to questioning, you know, the sort of new paradigm, which is a reaction to that. And so it's totally understandable that when people hear us, they're like, okay, these guys sound like they're about to sell me some kind of religion. We're not
Hmm.
doing that. We honestly are talking about a more skeptical position than physicalism. We're not trying to you know, sell any new belief system. We're trying to say, hey, let's get these beliefs that we have right now, which are unjustified, to stop clouding our thinking related to reality. And because that it's not just clouding our thinking, it's actually stopping us from looking into things. It's hurting science.
Hmm.
It's hurting people by basically making them believe they're machines. And
Dogmatism is always a bad thing, whether
yeah,
it's physicalism or whether it's religion or any other kind of dogmatism. It
yeah.
always leads to imbalances.
Yeah. So I'm with Sam Harris on the end of faith. Like, let's not have faith-based beliefs, at least used in the way of like, I'm just going to believe something for whether it's emotional reasons or just without sufficient evidence. So yeah, I think like the point of this one of today is to say, okay, look, we're going to talk about this from the point of view of playing this intellectual game. The point of that is not to again sell you idealism. It's just to point out why we shouldn't believe in mainstream physicalism.
Yeah. We're trying to give you permission to deny the mainstream explanation because it doesn't make any sense.
And then you
And
have
then from
permission to open an investigation into what is true, right?
right.
You know, in the same way I use this analogy a lot too of you know, if the clergy is going to tell Galileo that they're not going to look in the telescope because they already know what's in the heavens, well then that's to their own detriment and to their own ability to see reality more clearly.
Hmm. Yeah, before we get into this, I think it's important to note that we are not academic philosophers. We're just regular people who are super passionate about this. We're definitely open to criticism in the comments if you see any holes in what we're saying.
Speak
Um,
for
but
yourself. Just kidding.
yeah, that being said, we're kind of student. I don't know. Would you call us students of Bernardo Kastrup,
I would say
or?
it this way, like after having my experience and then like opening an investigation into like now being willing to question the mainstream narrative, I think that both of us have decided that something like what he's saying is the least wrong.
Hmm.
I think he would basically kind of agree with that too, in terms of that you can only really, you know, approximate reality through language and logic. Yeah, I think that what we really love about I think his version of this is not that it's like some new thing that this guy Bernardo Castro came up with, but that he's managed to put it into a language that can resonate with people like us and technical people, scientists, people who won't listen to somebody in saffron robes telling them to meditate, right? And I think that he's a genius in his contribution of dissociation as an explanation for the appearance of a dualistic physical world if reality is actually fundamentally non-dual and mental. So yes, students of always students of what he puts out there. I think he's way ahead of his time, but you know, we're not here to worship at the altar of Bernardo Kastrup either.
Yeah.
And he's but yeah, he's been a
But just
tremendous
to give
influence
people
on.
some context of where we're coming from.
Yeah,
Right.
and what we're about to share is this is a line of reasoning that comes from Bernardo. So for that, we're
Right.
grateful.
So, yeah. So now we're going to kind of transition into a more rigorous discussion about his five critiques of physicalism, with the first category or criteria being logical coherence. So I'll tell you how I understand logical coherence, and then maybe you can share what you think. But logical coherence is a sort of broad term that has to do with the meaning, circularity, or lack thereof of the concepts and definitions within a theory. So like within physicalism, this would refer to like this definition of this substance called physical or matter, and how matter or physical relies on mind to define it into existence. But then we define mind in terms of that same substance. So it's like a dog chasing its tail. It's circular. They're reliant upon each other, and therefore the definitions of both of those things are vacuous. It's just
Yeah.
empty.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to try to make that into a little bit more simple language, like what the physicalism does is it says there's this stuff called matter that exists outside of experience that is purely quantitative in nature, right? And that stuff just exists objectively outside experience and didn't require experience to come into being, and then it's from that we can actually get experience back out of it. And this is this is the circularity you're talking about. And to put it more simply, like, I often use this one. We can look at something like a number, some type of unit like 50 kilograms, right? And we can say, okay, this suitcase weighs 50 kilograms, be a damn heavy suitcase, but like 50-kilogram suitcase. The physicalism says that actually it's the number 50 from which we could derive some sort of experience of lifting something, of feeling mass or weight, and that we don't need the experience of lifting something in the first place to define what 50 give it meaning. But it's obviously the case that any kind of description, which is a quantitative description, right, is based on something experiential. And therefore, if it's devoid of experiential qualities completely, you can't expect to derive experiential qualities back from that thing.
Sure. And to kind of take a step back again and try to simplify even further, it's like multi-layered.
Mm-hmm.
The category of physical, or the substance called physical or matter, under materialism or physicalism, is defined as that which can wholly be described in quantities. There's nothing that you can say about matter, or there's nothing to say about matter other than what you can describe about it with numbers. But as you described, like the experience of heaviness, then we attach a number to that experience of heaviness. Everything is experiential first, and then these numbers are derived as a result of these experiences. And then, so what we're saying is that the descriptions of experiences are what are generating the experiences.
Yeah.
Because the numbers are the fundamental stuff of physicalism.
Yeah.
But obviously they always originated within experience. So it's
And
just
so that's
circular.
not coherent, is the point. So
Right.
when we're judging ontologies, we're going to go through these 5 categories of trying to look, because this is not science. We're talking about like assessing a philosophical ontology. On the category of coherence, and this is probably the most important one, like your idea should be coherent. It should make sense. If I said to you that, like, you know what, like you can go to the restaurant and you can take the menu, and from the menu you can get the meal out of it.
Yeah.
This is not coherent. This is obviously not coherent. You wouldn't be like, let me consider that. Yeah, maybe I can, if I make the menu detailed enough, if I write more and more about the food and I keep describing it better and better, eventually I'll eat the menu and it'll fill me up. This is not coherent, right? And it's that simple, actually, the mistake that's being made with physicalism. It gets so easily overlooked at how simple this mistake is, but it's very obvious. I think Bernardo often says, he's like, 200 years from now, people are going to be looking back and thinking, these idiots thought you could eat the menu. Like, that's what we literally think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So we don't think that the proposition that from quantities alone we can generate qualities, when those quantities to be defined required qualities of experience to begin with, is coherent.
Yeah. Totally incoherent. So yeah, I guess that brings us to critique number 2, which has to do with internal consistency. So the way I understand that is that if everything a theory says can be true at the same time with no contradiction, no logical contradictions, then it is internally consistent. And Kastrup says that physicalism is not internally consistent because it has a contradiction. Essentially, again, matter or physical stuff is defined as what can be wholly described by quantities, and it is that which has no qualities. But then we use that physical stuff to give an account for mind, which is that which has qualities. Without any satisfactory explanation or theoretical mechanism, even in principle, of how that's possible, this sort of categorical, incommensurable shift from non-qualitative to qualitative occurs. So essentially, what they're saying is that matter is both not qualities and also qualities. This is a P and not P logical contradiction.
Yeah. And I think something to point out here too is that it's never really put forward just how wild this idea is,
It's
that there's this
crazy.
stuff called matter out there
Yeah.
that people think, well, yeah, matter, it's the stuff I experience. It has these qualities to it. It feels solid. It looks this color. It smells. It's tangible. It's no, that's not what a physicalist means by matter. Like matter as a physicalist describes matter is not, you can't imagine it. It's not something you can imagine with any shape, any particular qualities at all. It's like equations. The best you can maybe do is like it's equations floating out in the ether somewhere,
Yeah.
but it's certainly not anything that you experience, right? Like all of that, the shape of the world, the color, all of that is actually happening inside, from a physicalist point of view, inside your skull. That all exists inside your head. What's actually out there, the physical world that they're saying is the fundamental basis of reality, is unimaginable to, because it has no qualities at
Mhm.
all.
Mhm. No qualities at all. And this is like super hard to grasp for even a materialist or a physicalist. They tend to not, I mean, I don't want to talk down on people too much, but they tend to not even understand the implications of their own belief system or their own metaphysical framework. There tends to be like this naive realism that most people hang on to. And I think Kastrup actually talks about this a lot in the science ideated book that you recommended to me. But um, all that being said, did you want to talk about number three
Well, no, let's
or?
stay here for just a second more, because like I think this, I bring up this idea of that, I'll say to somebody, look, this matter stuff that you're referring to, that you're calling the basis of reality, it's never been found. And this is
Mhm.
kind of gets at the
Sounds
same
crazy.
thing. Yeah, it sounds totally crazy, but because of course what we mean by, matter is what we experience, for the most part. And we're not arguing against that, but see, the physicalist is saying that stuff exists outside of experience, completely outside of experience, completely outside of consciousness, and it's only quantitative, whatever that means. Like it's only a description. And so the point is that that just the idea that this thing exists is this conceptual abstraction that that
Mhm.
that you're making up, and there's no evidence for it at all. And so most of the most naive sort of physicalists, right, are very, very adamantly against religion. They're like atheists that are constantly arguing about how we shouldn't believe in things that there's no evidence for. And and I think it's very, very, cogent to just say, this thing you're proposing, right, it has exactly as much evidence in favor of its existence as God does. So
Mhm.
we might as well call it a supernatural substance.
Yeah.
So because what does it mean, like when we talk about a supernatural? We're talking about something that isn't available to our sense perception at all. A religious person will be like, well, God is beyond this physical world. We can't see God, of course, right? But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And the physicalist is ruthless, maybe justifiably so, at saying, why should we believe that exists, right? At the same time, throwing stones sitting in a glass house, where you're basically saying, oh, there's a substance called matter, it's beyond our ability to see through sense perception, but trust me, it exists. And not only does it exist, it's that which creates all of this qualities of experience. It creates the entire thing that we do experience. So there is a hypocritical thing going on here, where there is very much an acknowledgement that we shouldn't do that when we're looking at another faith-based claim. But on this one, it gets a pass.
No, nobody's hypocritical and projecting. That's definitely not a thing. Nobody's out here just saying, "Trust me, bro." That's not what's
But to
happening
your
here.
point, you know what? I don't think it comes from a well thought out strategy here. It comes from what you said, which is that there's just a naive realism that like the implications of their own statements are not fully thought out.
Realized.
And yeah, and so it just like doesn't compute. Like, oh,
Mhm.
well, like no, like obviously there's a lot of things that are just taken as self-evident truths that
Mhm.
just haven't been examined. And so those, as long as those are believed in uncritically, it creates this kind of bad thinking.
It creates the Dunning-Kruger effect
It's what allows you to have an incoherent position and one that's logically inconsistent, but then fully say, well, yeah, but it's definitely
and
right.
be
You're
dogmatic
crazy.
about it.
You're totally crazy if you
Mhm.
question this, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so now we can move
Yeah,
on.
number 3 is conceptual parsimony.
Ah,
I didn't know if you wanted to talk about
yeah,
that one.
sure. So this is about what presuppositions that we have to make our worldview go. What things do we have to accept without justifying them, right? And so I think that, and this one is, I think, a really good way of putting it that Bernardo came up with is like we can start with where we all start, which is that one thing that we know for sure to be true is that I am conscious. Everyone knows this. This is the one thing that can't be an illusion.
I'm not sure I'm conscious.
Yeah. Cue the clown. Let's put up the that we have a nice little meme of a clown saying, you know, I'm not sure that I'm consciousness, said the conscious one.
Yeah.
It's a clownish thing to say. If consciousness is an illusion, it's an illusion to consciousness because something has to be aware of the illusion. So this is generally accepted too. I mean, every position. This is the solipsist position. If this is the only, it's something that's not an actual inference. It's just you know it directly that you are
Mhm.
conscious. And so if you were going to be the most skeptical, you would say this is all I'm gonna grant. I'm gonna say the entire existence exists in my mind because my mind is the only thing that there actually is. Because I'm not gonna accept any inference. But that's solipsism. We don't think that's reasonable. Why? Because I think it's reasonable to assume. I mean, it's not always evidenced, but reasonable to assume Alex is conscious. I mean, you know, he's okay at this podcast stuff and whatnot, but like I don't know. No, I'm going to grant Alex consciousness, intelligence, and other things, but let's go with consciousness. Like, I think it's reasonable to assume Alex is conscious. And why? Because Alex looks like me in every way. And I don't mean just like, you know, on the outside, like take apart Alex and you get the same things that you get when you take apart Stash.
Nah,
You
bro.
get,
I'm
you
built
get,
different.
yeah. Well, we'll see about that, but yeah, all of those things, and also the behavior, right? And we put those two things together and go, it's reasonable to assume. It would be sort of unreasonable to think like all of this is just he's a zombie and this is happening in my mind. And look, the physicalist and the idealist agree about these two, and the solipsist now would have a problem, but we think that's absurd. And
Mhm.
I think most rational people
So it's
also.
important to note that the physicalist would pretty much agree with whatever we're saying up until this point.
Yeah.
Right.
So we have this one jump where we say there's other conscious beings. I'm conscious. Now, number two, there's other conscious beings. The physicalist then has to say, like I said a minute ago, there's this stuff outside of consciousness that exists that's called physical. And that's beyond our ability to, there's no direct contact with this stuff, but it's out there. And then the fourth presupposition is the stuff that is out there that we don't have experience with is what causes our conscious experience. And so now basically we have four things that we have to accept just based on axiomatically stating them. And this is not parsimonious. Here's why. Parsimony has to do with how many things you need to get to state in order to explain the world. And we'll get into explanatory power later. And the idea here is if you don't need to postulate anything that you don't know, if you can explain the world without it, then you shouldn't postulate extra things.
Hmm.
And we would say that you certainly don't need this. Not only that, you don't need these extra two assumptions, because if you do postulate them, they lead to the first two exemptions we had, which had to do with coherence and internal consistency. Because
Exactly.
you've now defined this substance which has no qualities, and you've basically defined mind out of the picture of reality, the most obvious thing. You've defined that out, and you now need to get it back, which is not coherent. So yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
if you want
So if you haven't figured it out yet, like I'm talking to the people watching the show, we're essentially talking about the hard problem of consciousness in a variety of different ways here. We're pointing out all of the issues. Um, but yeah, like to talk about Occam's razor, like Occam specifically said something like, do not multiply entities unnecessarily. Meaning what you already said, which is that you should use the least amount of assumptions possible to explain any set of data that you can. And the reason for that is because the more assumptions you have that are unnecessary or not needed to explain the data, the more chances you have to be wrong. Um, so it's always the best idea to use the least amount of assumptions possible, as long as you can coherently explain the data with those. And what happens here is that physicalism makes an extra assumption that's not needed, which we'll get into when we talk about idealism. It's actually not needed. This postulate of this substance outside of mind is not needed to explain the data, um, our experiences, and come up with a coherent worldview. But not only that, it also creates the problems that we already addressed in points 1 and 2. It creates the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is not just hard, it's unbridgeable because the terms in which it's presented are bad, essentially.
Yeah, I
Be-
mean, I think the thing to notice about the hard problem is not that it's a problem to be solved. It's like a flashing warning sign saying, "Go back and look at your fundamental assumptions." Well, because you must have made a mistake in your
Absolutely.
assumption. And we're saying the mistake here that leads to the hard problem is the assumption of this physical stuff called matter outside of consciousness. And
Hmm.
once you have assumed that, that's what needs to go back and be questioned. We don't need to sit with the problem and be like, how are we going to solve this problem? It's like if you assume the earth is flat, right? Well, now you've got a hard problem of flat earth. No, you don't have a hard problem of flat earth. The earth, you made a bad assumption. And it leads to a hard problem of how are we going to explain all of these things that we're observing now that we've made this assumption. Well, that's a real hard problem. It's like, no, it's a problem that's genesis lies in a false assumption. And so it's this unparsimoniousness of the physicalist axioms that leads to all of these
Yeah.
problems. And when you remove when we don't, and very nicely, it's not necessary to make this assumption in order to explain reality as we
Yeah,
observe.
saying we're going to solve the hard problem is like ramming your head into a wall, thinking that it's eventually going to stop hurting. I mean, I suppose eventually, if you ram it hard enough, it will stop hurting, but for other reasons. And
Yeah, I think even like the analogy I gave before about the menu, like the hard problem is basically saying if someone's going to work on the hard problem, that's saying I'm going to keep working on the menu. I'm going to keep making the menu more and more detailed. And eventually, if I just keep doing that, eventually the menu is going to become the meal.
Mhm,
And no, the mistake was thinking that the menu is the thing
mhm.
and defining it to say, well, that's reality. What the description is the reality. No, the description is the description, and no amount of detailed description makes it the thing described. And this is why it's good to look at all your assumptions and be like, let's make the minimum assumptions we need to, because as the old saying goes, making assumptions makes an ass out of you and me, right? And so
Yeah.
to age.
I haven't heard that one in a while, man. He brought that one back. Okay, so yeah, I think we've thoroughly addressed that one.
So
The
let's be
next one is
parsimonious. Let's
treacherous.
just not let's, this is the idea, idea of let's not, it's unparsimonious also to postulate a God that created everything, right? You've got
Mhm.
all kinds of problems that now arise from this assertion too. So we're not leaving this criticism for just the atheist physicalist. Like we have the same problem with somebody that says, you know what, I can explain all this. I just need to invoke a God. And we just are saying the physicalist is doing the same thing. They just call it
Mhm.
matter outside of consciousness. It's
Mhm.
a supernatural substance as well. We don't need any supernatural stuff to explain the world. Let's be naturalists. Let's stick with what we know.
Yeah, what I'm about to say is some amalgamation of what Donald Hoffman has said, what Bernardo has said, maybe a little bit of Rupert Spira, but essentially, Einstein said, "Give me the speed of light being a constant, and I will show you space time." The religious person says, "Give me God, and I will show you his creation." But the analytic idealist says, "Don't give me anything. I will give you everything." Like, there's just simply not the same kinds of assumptions happening.
I want to say one more thing on that too, in that what the physicalist is doing is postulating a new category, right? Like, so we make a jump from the solipsist and we say, well, look, there's other mental states outside my own mental states that exist in the world, right? But notice that we're just postulating more of the same thing that we know to
Mhm,
exist. The physicalist
mhm.
is saying, no, there's this other thing that is a completely new category of ontological thing that I'm going to postulate out there that I don't know to exist. And that leap is a much bigger leap of faith than to
It's a
say
it's a
what I already know to be the thing is just what else is out there, right?
it's a bigger leap, and you have to justify that leap, philosophically,
Right.
right? And the sort of justification doesn't exist because not only do you not need it to explain the data, but it also creates unsolvable problems.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just wrong. It's just bad.
Well, it just leads to problems that should make you go back and question that assumption
Mhm.
and say, like, do I really know that? Do I know that there's this physical stuff outside of consciousness? Is that something that physics tells me has to be the case or
You
not?
know, it's funny you say that, right? Like, because it should, and it seems like a really simple Oh, maybe I should go back and question that. Like, do I really know that? Like, it seems simple enough for me to do.
Yeah.
But you'll find that it's not so simple for people in practice.
It's because that assumption that there is this objective stuff is what separated science from religion in the beginnings of science. And so to
Mhm.
question that assumption feels like, to somebody who's really identified with physicalism being true, it feels like you might as well throw out all of science if I do
Mhm.
that. And that's
Mhm.
not the case. We do
It's
not
not
need
the
to throw
case.
out all of science by throwing out physicalism. Physicalism is not science. Physicalism is an 18th century ontology that didn't come from science. Yes, it was useful to break this off as part of the genesis of science too, but we've started basically believing our own bullshit after a while. And
Yeah,
instead of
even
using it as a tool to like separate what science is from theology and stop getting burned at the stake, we've now said, no, that wasn't just a strategy. That was that's actually how the world is,
Mhm.
and we made it up in the first place.
Yeah, even Aristotle knew when he sort of created the physical sciences that he was just carving out like a small section of experience and explain. Essentially, he knew that he was explaining the behavior of nature, not what nature was, and he wasn't going to be able to say anything about mind or spirit or soul or psyche or whatever you want to call it. Um, but over time we've like forgotten this and then started thinking that the map Aristotle started drawing is the territory, and we've just forgotten.
Yeah, yeah. What's interesting about that too is that it does cut out the mind right at the beginning, but it did that intentionally because that was the
Intentionally.
domain of the church. And like that's what allowed them to do that. And then yeah, there's just you know what, like I guess I don't need that. That like mind must not exist essentially, and everything's just matter
Yeah.
because that's all there is, right? And so it's this and then you end up with this hard problem of, well, wait, but mind does exist. So how am I going to explain mind in terms of only matter? Because that's the problem I now have before me. And of course you can't. And so, that's where we are. And we just kind of never go back to that initial assumption and be like, maybe I need to question something that is more fundamental. that move seems like opening the gates to throw out all rationality and objectivity, and people
Yeah,
don't want to do that.
but the problem is it's actually an emotional attachment that
Mm.
doesn't want to let you do that. It's not some kind of like rational deliberation that you've done and realized, oh, there's no point in questioning that. It's just emotional. That's what I find anyway. You know,
Understandable too. Understandable in a way, because there's no doubt that irrational thinking from a religious belief has led to unbelievable
sure,
suffering. And
sure.
so, and also, like, look at the success. The other thing is obvious. Look at the success of science and technology development, and they'll point to that and say, well, that's evidence of the success of physicalism. No, it's not. It's evidence of success of the scientific method, which
Yeah,
doesn't
which relies
care
on
about the
methodological
ontology.
it relies on methodological naturalism, not some materialist assumption. It
Right,
just
right, right.
relies on like tomorrow is going to be similar to today. I mean, that's all.
Relies on observations through sense perception, right?
Mhm.
So, and that's what we call the physical world. And it just goes, well, as long as I can observe it, and then I can do my science. And we agree, you can observe what we call the physical world. We're just saying that there's the assumption that then that is the base level of reality. That is physicalism. That is not science, and that is all we're questioning. Science fits perfectly well within an idealist ontology as well. And
Yeah.
so, but there's this feeling, like you say, that like, oh, if you're throwing out physicalism, that means throwing out science, and it's not the case.
And I'm glad we're talking about science now because that is a perfect intro into the next thing, which is the empirical adequacy of physicalism. Because there are things that we find with science that don't appear to match up with a physicalist ontology or a purely physical world, or the entailments of physicalism, or the expectations of something like physicalism.
I think to point out here too, one thing that's interesting though is, of course, most of the observations do, right? Because what we're doing with science is we're observing the physical world, what we call the physical world, meaning we're using sense perception and taking data, right? And so it's not surprising that the results from that method are going to comport with a physicalist view of reality for the most part. But Alex is right here when we say, okay, but is that always the case, or is there empirical data? So again, we're talking about ontology here. We're talking about metaphysics. The role of empirical adequacy is basically to look at the body of empirical data and say, does the empirical data, is it feasible under my ontology or not? If it's not, if there's empirical data from science that says this doesn't really match your metaphysical worldview, it's the metaphysical worldview that has to change, not the science. The science
Yeah.
is the science.
And when we get into these topics, I just want to make it very clear again for anybody who's watching, we are not an authority on these subjects. Some of the things that we're going to bring up in this category are in contention. And we can talk about those and you can comment about them and we can make future videos. We're not experts in these fields. We're just talking about these things in a very meta philosophical way. Um,
Important to
so,
say, though, that also, though, the scientists themselves are also not experts in the philosophical interpretation of their data. They
mhm.
are experts in the data and how it's collected and what it means in terms of the scientific method. But there's often an air of, well, whatever the metaphysical beliefs of the scientist are is also somehow taken on authority, when no, they're an expert in the scientific method, not a philosophy, which is very ever present when you start to see some scientists start to expound on the philosophy. So the idea that there's not fair game to talk about the interpretation of the scientific results outside the discipline is not valid. Like there's nothing that gives a scientist that's not trained in philosophy any more standing than anybody else when they look at
Yeah,
the philosophical implications of the scientific data.
and what I find to be the case in my interaction with these kinds of scientists or people in general is that they'll be an expert in their field, and they'll be very, very good at that. but a lot of times their philosophical viewpoints are poorly thought out. It's just they're kind of confused.
Well,
Not
there's
not
like
to
what
sound like
mostly
I'm so
happens
much
is
better, but
they're taking a specific ontology like mainstream physicalism to be self-evident. And therefore, whatever the data is, if it's not in comporting with physicalism, then it's dismissed as
mhm,
the evidence there must be something wrong with the evidence, right? Because we already know reality is physical, that kind of
mhm.
thing. So anyway, to get into empirical adequacy, we, when you look at the body of empirical data, there are things that 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 I think are very obvious from both the foundations of physics, from neuroscience, from evolutionary theory, from thermodynamics, even that don't support that basically
Yeah, so I suppose we can talk about physics first, my favorite part of all this, right? So what Bernardo brings up a lot is this refutation of physical realism.
Mm.
So over the decades, I mean, okay, so we could go all the way back to Einstein, where he made the statement, God does not play dice with the universe. He was not a huge fan of quantum. He thought it was incomplete, if not flat out wrong. And so, a physical realism is this idea that particles or physical stuff has freestanding, objective physical properties. No matter who's looking, no matter who's measuring, it's just the state of the world. It's this objective place with definite properties, no matter what. And what we found with quantum experiments over the decades is that's just simply not true. Um,
It's important to point out that early on, like the conceptual implications of quantum mechanics, were like people were trying to wrestle with the interpretation, right? And what's happened over the decades that you're reporting to is that some of these disagreements have been settled by the actual experimental empirical data to go one way, and that way is that Einstein was wrong.
Einstein was wrong.
Yeah, and
Hmm.
and so we think now that like that then, and this is what Bernardo talks about, that it's not really feasible to hold a physicalist interpretation of quantum
Yeah,
mechanics anymore.
physicalism implicitly relies on this assumption of local realism. And we found that this assumption is just simply false through these tests with entangled photons, these Bell inequality tests.
I mean,
Um,
that's, yeah, one part of the data, but like, yeah, I think and this is something I'm going to read like a small passage here from this is from Eddington, or the Stanley Eddington, talking about this because I think a lot of confusion comes up, and we want to point this out too. That people that use quantum mechanics to like justify their spiritual beliefs are definitely going well beyond, and like, and they're using science in a way that it shouldn't be used, right? What we're talking about here is, do physicalist beliefs hold up under the empirical data? Is physicalism still empirically adequate with these results? We're not saying this means idealism is true. If is the case,
right.
we're just saying that should we still believe in physicalism, or does this empirical data hurt somebody who wants to hold an ontology or falsify an ontology of physicalism? And we think it does. And some of the founders of quantum mechanics agreed. They said this. Now, the great difference, Eddington says, between the old and the new physics is not that the latter is relativistic, non-deterministic, four-dimensional, or any of those sorts of things. The great difference between the old physics and the new physics is both much simpler and much more profound. Both the old and the new physics were dealing with shadow symbols, but the new physics was forced to be aware of that fact, forced to be aware that it was dealing with shadows and illusions, not reality. And basically, Schrodinger drives this point home when he says, please note that the very recent advance of quantum and relativistic physics does not lie in the world of physics itself having acquired this shadowy character. It has ever since Democritus of Abdera, and even before, but we were not aware of it. We thought we were dealing with the world itself. And so these guys were saying back then, like, oh, now that we can see that this stuff we're studying that we've been calling matter is actually observer dependent, we thought we were looking at an objective physical world. We're not. And they came to that conclusion back in those days. And it's really just been a matter of people that want to hold on to that idea of an objective physical world, that are like, no, you're going to need extraordinary evidence for us to walk away from that.
Yeah, the founders of QM all knew this. and somewhat accepted it, depending on which one we want to talk about. But, Schrodinger was definitely on this track that physicalism isn't true. And Heisenberg was somewhat on the path. He said something like, we can never observe nature as it is in itself. We can only observe nature as it presents to our method of questioning. This means that physicalism can't be true, because what physicalism does is say that nature as it presents to our method of questioning is what nature actually is.
Right. And we'll grant that these interpretations, the problem with empirical adequacy is that you can always be like, no, I have a new interpretation of that data. So for instance, the many worlds, Everett and many worlds theory, like you can always have something where you go, no, I can save physicalism if I posit, this. And we'll grant that this is not the category we live and die on. Like we already said that physicalism is incoherent, internally inconsistent, non-parsimonious, and we'll get to its explanatory power in a minute. We don't need this. But it just happens to be the case that if you look around and we look at the observations coming out of science, in neuroscience, which we'll maybe get to in a minute too, and maybe we shouldn't dwell too much on this, but there are things that we observe that should make us question physicalism, and like you say, there's a resistance to doing that comes not from a place of just rational skepticism necessarily, but a place of
Yeah. So I think that kind of covers the quantum aspect. I guess we can get into neuroscience a little bit, but maybe not too deep, because we're not neuroscientists. But I'll say this: there appears to be sometimes an inverse or an inverse correlation between what we would consider the neural correlates of consciousness and what we would say is an expanded experience. So what I mean by that is, like, there are situations like when people take psychedelics, when people meditate, or when asphyxiation occurs, where the overall metabolism of the brain goes down and experience, in some sense, goes up.
Yeah. Like it's a more expanded experience. And if your argument is as a physicalist, it's brain metabolism generally that is generating your experience, then you have to explain why when brain metabolism goes down, you get an expanded experience.
Mm-hmm.
This
Mm-hmm.
isn't what you'd expect. There's also things like acquired savant syndrome, where the brain is damaged, and the damage, instead of resulting in impaired cognitive function, results in an expansion of cognitive function, and or like somebody can just suddenly speak a new language or play a concert level piano. These just don't fit the mechanistic description of what's going on there. So there's a whole bunch of other categories in the scientific literature of data that really, when you look at it, doesn't make sense under physicalism. Like I said, many people will say, well, if it doesn't make sense under physicalism, and we quote, no physicalism is true already, there must be something wrong with the data. And that's just basically, and they'll call it
Classic.
pseudoscience. They'll say, well, this is pseudoscience, but and there is such a thing as pseudoscience, and we should not be doing pseudoscience. But sometimes the definition of pseudoscience is just heresy in the Church of Physicalism, and that's a different story. So if you're overly skeptical about data because it doesn't fit your pre-existing worldview, the Church can do that too, and they did do that. And that's not an honest way to deal with the data as it comes in. It's built off of defending metaphysical assumptions.
Yeah, what we haven't mentioned yet too is near-death experiences.
Mm.
There's like thousands upon thousands of these reports. They get really weird and strange and seem unexplainable. And a lot of these occur when there's very little and sometimes no brain activity whatsoever. So they would this is another part of the empirical adequacy of physicalism, because there doesn't seem to be any account of how this would be possible, right? Or
And I want to be clear too. Like, let's say none of this was true, none of this empirical data. Let's say the empirical data always was in complete agreement with physicalism, right? That wouldn't mean anything with regards to whether or not physicalism is true, or whether idealism would be true or not. Like, this is actually, like I said at the beginning, sort of like what you'd expect. The fact that we see things that don't go along with physicalism is surprising, because all of the data is taken through sense perception. And so, again, I think that this category is very important, because what can happen is it can affect science. It can be like, let's not look into things because we already know the answer, and that's always bad. So yeah, in terms of empirical adequacy, when you compare physicalism and idealism, there's nothing in the empirical data, right, that that doesn't can't be explained under idealism. In fact,
Yeah,
it's better explained under idealism. A lot of the data is the point, like that there's not this head scratching, like, why is people reporting expanded experience when brain activity, brain metabolism is going down? That's kind of a head scratcher. Why is it that physics is seemingly saying that like nothing physical actually really exists outside of observation? These kind of things make perfect sense under idealism. It's what you'd expect.
mhm. Yeah, and this was a big reason why analytic idealism was so attractive to me when I first found it, was because I was searching for a framework that could make sense of the experiences that I've had anecdotally. And physicalism just wasn't it. Like, it just never made sense. It was never coherent. It was never cohesive. Idealism does put a lot of these things that are on the kind of gray edges of what could be understood under physicalism, and it just takes everything and just everything
Oh, that's
flows so
expected.
nicely.
Yeah, it's expected under this ontology. Like, just like, I mean, even very concrete things like entanglement, or the spookiness of quantum mechanics, and
Hmm.
you know, the reason they're spooky is because we go, well, there's these real particles that exist. So why are they behaving like in ways that don't comport with being a particle? Well, because there's not real particles that exist. That's why. The two particles that are entangled, are a representation of a single underlying mental process. And
Hmm.
that's why it looks like to us that this is like unexplainable, because I'm looking at two separate things, but we're just not. We're looking at one thing, and that's two separate things is how it appears to our sense perception. And so things like that become not a problem anymore, because we've taken the false assumptions out of our metaphysics.
Hmm.
All right, so maybe we move on to the fifth and final category. It's been kind of a long journey through these, and that's explanatory power.
Yeah, so I think explanatory power refers to obviously the ability of a theory to explain things. And what does that mean? I guess what that means is you kind of wake up here one day and you're kind of like behind your eyes. And so, like, how is that possible? How'd you get here? How does this place work? What is this place?
Well, hold on. Very simply, it's mind is the most obvious thing. I am conscious is the most obvious thing that there is, that everyone knows to be true, can't be an illusion. If your metaphysics can't explain the existence of mind, then it's not very explanatorily powerful.
But yeah, I would say its explanatory power is non-existent because
Right.
it's the only thing we know to exist.
Yeah, and it's the one thing that needs to be for everything else to exist. And if your ontology doesn't have an explanation for this, which physicalism does not, right, then yeah, how can you claim that your ontology explains anything? And you might say, well, idealism says that everything's mental. It doesn't explain anything about the physical. Why is there the physical? But the thing is, we do have an explanation for that, and we
Mhm.
can probably get into that on another episode. But we don't have. A lot of people will say, well, look, idealism is just sort of the reverse of physicalism. They say it's only physical, you say it's only mental, so you both should have a hard problem. They have the hard problem of consciousness, and you have the hard problem of matter, right? Is that
Yeah.
true, Alex?
No, it's certainly not true. We know that the appearance of matter can be generated within minds.
Yeah,
It's just
happens all the
trivial.
time. Yeah,
Yeah, it's just trivial.
every time you go to sleep and have a dream, you have mind generated matter, and it's not at all uncommon,
Yeah,
right?
you have spatio-temporal coordinates. You have everything you need there in the
But
dream.
furthermore, we haven't taken out of our picture the qualities of experience, and so it's not a hard problem to get them back. We don't need to
Mhm.
get them back. They are our starting point, and matter showing up as a measurement of those qualities is not a hard problem. It's a hard problem the other way around.
Mm.
So
So
yeah, I mean, just
explanatory
simply
power.
saying, is physicalism, does it have explanatory power? No. And these are the 5 categories you should look at when you're judging these ontologies. Does this mean we've now just proven physicalism is false and it's the only alternative is idealism? No, but we've definitely shown that it's there's no reason to take it seriously.
Yeah, I mean, you could make the argument that this prove because you can come to proofs through things like contradictions. If something is a logical contradiction, it's just always false. Um, I don't
Sure.
know. The
Yeah,
audience
but
can be their
I
own
mean, I
judge,
think
I
as far as
suppose.
it goes with metaphysics, again, we're always trying to be as least wrong, right, as we can be. Like, is anything ultimately true? Can we say idealism if we put out point by point, this is true? Not exactly. Like all of this logical reasoning and philosophy is built by our language and our rules of logic, which we made up. So ultimately, that tool, just like our sense perception is not necessarily a tool that can tell us the exact nature of reality because it's an evolved set of senses on a rock. Also our reasoning that we've come up with and our language in order to describe things is limited by our finite minds as well. But what we can do, and what the point of the philosophy is let's have our thinking be as clear as possible, and let's not be assuming things that we don't know, and then if we find that the result of assuming something is that it becomes incoherent, well then there's no reason to take this seriously.
Yeah, so if you guys are still here, thanks for being with us. Let us know what you want to see in future episodes. We definitely plan on making an episode about AI consciousness or lack thereof, but drop us a comment, show us some love for the algorithm.